October 17, 1943, 22,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The B-17 flying fortress named Devil's Own was 3 minutes from the initial point when the flak started. First Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Marchetti felt the aircraft shudder as an 88 Michel detonated 200 yards below, the concussion rattling instruments and sending a shiver through the control yoke. "Flak at 6 o'clock level," called the tail gunner over the intercom, his voice tight but controlled. Marchetti checked his instruments. Airspeed, 180 mph. Altitude, 22,000 feet. Course, 94 degrees. Formation position, tight to the lead aircraft's right wing. Everything by the book. Everything exactly as briefed during the 400 mission briefing when Major Kellner had stood before 42 crew members and told them that today's target was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and that losses would be acceptable. Acceptable had turned out to mean catastrophic. The 381st Bomb Group had crossed into German airspace at 8:47 hours with 21 B-17s. By 9:35, 4 were gone, 2 to German fighters over Belgium, 1 to engine failure, and 1 that simply exploded at 19,000 feet when flak found the bomb bay. Now, at 10:12 hours, approaching the most heavily defended target in Germany, 17 bombers remained. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high." The call came from the ball turret gunner. Marchetti looked left and saw them. A dozen Bf-109s diving out of the sun at 25,000 feet, dropping toward the formation with geometric precision. The bomber formation began evasive maneuvers, not wild jinking, that would break the defensive box that kept them alive, but slight altitude changes, coordinated shifts. Up 200 feet, down 300, level again. The idea was to make the German fighters adjust their attack angles by seconds, create margins of error. But there was a problem, and Marchetti had noticed it 3 missions ago, though he hadn't known what it meant until now. The altimeter lag. Every B-17 altimeter had a slight delay, a mechanical sluggishness between actual altitude and what the instrument displayed. At low altitude, the lag was negligible, maybe 50 feet. But at 20,000 feet and above, in thin air where pressures shifted rapidly, the lag grew. The instrument could be 200, sometimes 300 feet behind reality. Which meant when the formation leader called, climb to 22,500, and every pilot looked at his altimeter and adjusted throttles to reach that altitude, they weren't actually reaching the same altitude. Some were still at 22,200. Others had overshot to 22,700. The formation, which looked tight from the ground, was actually staggered vertically by 500 feet or more. And German fighter pilots knew it. They dove not at the center of the formation but at the gaps, the vertical seams where bombers thought they were in mutual defensive range, but were actually isolated, their gunners unable to provide overlapping fire. The Bf-109s came through those seams like scalpels, their 20 cannons stitching lines of destruction across wings and fuselages before pulling up and climbing for another pass. Devil's Own took hits from 2 fighters. The number 3 engine erupted in flame. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Danny Hollies, reached for the fire suppression switch while Marchetti fought to keep the aircraft level. Behind them, the waist gunner was screaming that the hydraulics were gone and the ball turret wasn't responding. They stayed in formation. Barely. Marchetti feathered the burning engine, adjusted power on the remaining 3, and held position 200 yards off the lead bomber's wing. At 10:18 hours, they dropped their bombs. At 10:19, they turned for home. At 10:24, 3 more B-17s went down. Marchetti brought Devil's Own back to RAF Ridgewell on 3 engines, the hydraulic system half-functional, and 17 holes in the fuselage. When he climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature at altitude. The intelligence officer took notes. The chaplain moved through the dispersal area, stopping at the bombers that hadn't returned, checking his clipboard against the empty hardstands. Marchetti walked to the debriefing room and tried to explain what he had seen: the vertical gaps in the formation, the altimeter lag, the way German fighters were exploiting the seams. The intelligence officer nodded politely and wrote nothing down. That night, lying in his bunk, Marchetti stared at the curved metal ceiling of the Nissen hut and did the math. 21 bombers had gone out. 14 had come back. 7 lost. 70 crew members, probably 40 dead, 30 captured if they were lucky. And tomorrow they would do it again, with the same tactics, the same formation discipline, and the same altimeter lag that was killing them. Unless someone fixed it. The B-17's altimeter was a mechanical marvel, a pressure-sensitive instrument that measured atmospheric pressure and translated it into altitude above sea level. It was calibrated, tested, and certified to military specifications. It was accurate to within 50 feet under ideal conditions. But conditions at 20,000 feet over Germany were never ideal. The problem was physics. Atmospheric pressure decreased with altitude, but not in a perfectly linear way. Temperature, humidity, and rapid altitude changes all affected how quickly the pressure reading stabilized. The altimeter's aneroid capsule, a sealed metal chamber that expanded and contracted with pressure changes, had mechanical inertia. It couldn't respond instantly. At low altitude, where pressure changes were gradual, the lag was minimal. But at high altitude, where formations climbed and descended rapidly to evade flak and fighters, the lag became pronounced. A bomber climbing at 500 feet per minute might show 21,800 feet on the altimeter while actually flying at 22,100 feet. 300 feet. In isolation, meaningless. In a tight defensive formation where survival depended on overlapping fields of fire, it was the difference between protection and death. Marchetti had first noticed the discrepancy on his fourth mission, a raid to Bremen in late September. The formation had climbed to 24,000 feet to avoid a flak concentration, and Marchetti had glanced at the bomber flying 500 yards to his left. It should have been level with him. The lead bombardier had called for 24,000 feet, and every pilot had adjusted to match. But the other bomber was visibly lower, not by much, maybe 200 or 300 feet. Marchetti had assumed the pilot was sloppy, maintaining poor formation discipline. Then he looked at his own altimeter, 24,000 feet exactly. He looked outside again. The other bomber was still lower, which meant either that pilot's altimeter was wrong, or Marchetti's was wrong, or both were wrong in different ways. Over the next 3 missions, Marchetti started watching. He noticed that when the formation climbed quickly, the bombers spread out vertically. When they descended, they compressed back together. The tighter the altitude changes, the more pronounced the spreading. He mentioned it to his co-pilot Hollies during the October 14 mission to Schweinfurt. The first Schweinfurt raid, before the disaster of the second one 3 days later. "You ever notice the formation gets loose at altitude?" Marchetti asked. "Yeah, everyone gets tired. Formation discipline goes to hell after 6 hours. Not horizontal spacing, vertical. We're not flying at the same altitude even when the instruments say we are." Hollies thought about it. Altimeter lag. "Maybe. I think the instruments can't keep up with altitude changes in thin air." After the second Schweinfurt raid, the one where 7 bombers didn't come home, Marchetti started documenting the problem. He timed altitude changes and compared them to his altimeter readings. He asked other pilots if they noticed the same lag. Most hadn't. Most trusted their instruments completely, the way pilots were trained to. But 2 pilots confirmed what Marchetti had seen. Captain Jim Carver, a lead pilot with 14 missions, said formations seemed looser at altitude. Lieutenant Phil Ketchum mentioned that altitude corrections never quite matched up. Marchetti wrote a 3-page report explaining the altimeter lag problem and proposing a solution. Recalibrate altimeters to anticipate the lag at high altitude, or add a secondary reference system that pilots could cross-check during formation flying. He submitted the report to the Squadron operations officer, Major Raymond Stiles, who had flown exactly 2 combat missions before being promoted to a desk job. Stiles read the report, set it down, and looked at Marchetti with the expression of a man who had just been handed a technical manual written in crayon. "Lieutenant, your job is to fly the aircraft, not redesign the instrumentation." "Sir, I'm not suggesting a redesign. I'm just pointing out that the altimeters have lag at high altitude, and it's affecting formation integrity. The altimeters are calibrated to military specifications. They're tested and certified. If there was a systemic problem, the engineers would have identified it. With respect, sir, the engineers aren't flying combat missions at 25,000 feet over Germany." Stiles's expression hardened. "Are you suggesting you know more about aeronautical instrumentation than Boeing's engineering department?" "No, sir. I'm suggesting that what works on paper doesn't always work in combat." "Your report is noted, dismissed." Marchetti left the office knowing his report would go nowhere. It would be filed, forgotten, and eventually discarded. The system didn't want to hear that its instruments were flawed. But the problem remained, and men were still dying. 2 nights later, lying awake in his bunk at 200 hours, Marchetti decided that if the system wouldn't fix the altimeters, he would fix them himself. Not officially, not with authorization, just a small modification to his own aircraft's altimeter, a mechanical adjustment that would compensate for the lag and give him an accurate reading at high altitude. He knew someone who might help: Staff Sergeant Carl Voss, a B-17 flight engineer who had worked as an instrument mechanic before the war and who treated the bombers with the reverence most men reserved for cathedrals. Marchetti found Voss the next morning, working on an engine in the maintenance hangar. "Sarge, I need to ask you something, hypothetically." Voss looked up from the carburetor he was cleaning. "Hypothetically means you're about to do something that'll get us both court-martialed." "Hypothetically," Marchetti continued, "could you modify an altimeter to compensate for lag at high altitude?" Voss set down his wrench. "You're serious?" "Completely. You know those instruments are sealed and certified, right? Tampering with them is a violation of about 6 different regulations." "I know." Voss wiped his hands on a rag, thinking, what kind of lag are we talking about? 200 to 300 feet at 20,000 feet and above, more during rapid altitude changes. And you want me to recalibrate the mechanism to anticipate that lag? If it's possible. Voss stared at the B-17 parked 20 yards away, its nose art depicting a grinning devil holding a wrench. He was quiet for a long time. "It's possible," he said finally, "but I'd need to disassemble the altimeter, adjust the aneroid capsule's tension spring, and recalibrate the dial. It would take about 4 hours, and if I screw it up, the instrument could read 3,000 feet off and you'd fly straight into a mountain. But if you don't screw it up, then you'd have an altimeter that reads true altitude even during rapid pressure changes." Voss looked at Marchetti. "Why are you doing this?" "Because the formation gaps are getting pilots killed, and because nobody else is going to fix it." Voss nodded slowly. "When?" "Tonight after lights out." "You're insane." "Probably." That night at 2300 hours, Voss and Marchetti climbed into Devil's Own while the rest of the base slept. Voss brought his tools. Marchetti brought a flashlight and the desperate hope that this wasn't the worst idea he'd ever had. It took 5 hours, not 4. Voss worked with the precision of a surgeon, disassembling the altimeter's intricate mechanism, adjusting the tension spring by tiny increments, recalibrating the dial using a portable pressure chamber he'd borrowed from the instrument shop. At 400 hours, he reassembled the altimeter and tested it. The needle moved smoothly, responding instantly to pressure changes. Voss ran it through a simulated climb from sea level to 25,000 feet. The reading matched the pressure chamber's reference gauge within 20 feet. "It works," Voss said, his voice carrying a mix of pride and terror. "But if anyone asks, I had nothing to do with this." Fair enough. Marchetti didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark mess hall, drinking bad coffee and waiting for morning, wondering if he just sabotaged his own aircraft or discovered something that might actually save lives. The answer would come in 5 hours, when the 381st Bomb Group launched its next mission into Germany. October 20, 1943. The target was Düren, a rail marshalling yard 60 miles west of Cologne. Intelligence called it a moderate-risk mission, only 90 minutes over enemy territory, lighter flak concentrations than the Ruhr Valley probable fighter opposition, but nothing like the swarms that had torn apart the Schweinfurt raids. Devil's Own lifted off at 8:15 hours. Marchetti felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the runway fell away and they climbed into the gray English dawn. His eyes went to the altimeter. The modified instrument looked identical to before, same face, same markings, same needle. But Voss's modifications had changed something fundamental. The lag was gone. At 8:47, the formation assembled over the English coast. 23 B-17s from the 381st, joined by aircraft from 2 other groups. 57 bombers total, stacked in combat boxes at altitudes ranging from 20,000 to 24,000 feet. Marchetti held position 500 yards off the lead aircraft's right wing. As the formation climbed toward operating altitude, he watched his altimeter. 15,000 feet, 18,000, 21,000. The needle moved smoothly, precisely, tracking every 100-foot increment. Then he looked outside. The bomber to his left, a B-17 named Memphis Belle Roman II, was supposed to be at his altitude. The lead aircraft had called for 22,000 feet. Every pilot in the formation had acknowledged and adjusted. But Memphis Belle II was 200 feet lower. Marchetti could see it clearly, the way the perspective lines angled, the way the exhaust trails sat beneath his own aircraft's level. Which meant either that aircraft was flying wrong, or Marchetti's modified altimeter was reading wrong, or every other altimeter in the formation was still lagging, showing 22,000 feet while the aircraft actually flew at 21,800. Marchetti's altimeter read 22,200, which meant, if Voss's modification worked, Devil's Own was actually at 22,200 feet, while the rest of the formation was staggered between 21,700 and 22,100. "Danny," Marchetti said over the intercom, "look at the bomber at 10 o'clock. What altitude does it look like relative to us?" Hollis leaned forward, checking, maybe 200 feet below. "That's what I thought." "Why? Formation's supposed to be level." "It's supposed to be, but I think the altimeters are lagging. Everyone thinks they're at 22,000, but they're actually spread across 400 feet of altitude." "Including us?" "No, I think we're actually where the altimeter says we are." Marchetti paused. "I had Voss modify our altimeter, recalibrated it to eliminate the lag." Hollis turned and stared at him. "You did what?" "I had our altimeter modified. It now reads true altitude." "Jesus Christ, Bobby. That's unauthorized modification of flight-critical equipment. If Stiles finds out." "He won't, unless it doesn't work and we fly into a mountain." The formation crossed the English Channel at 9:12. By 9:35, they were over Belgium, climbing to 23,000 feet to clear flak concentrations. Marchetti watched his altimeter climb through 22,500, 22,700, 22,900, 23,000. Outside, the formation was spreading. Bombers that should have been level were now visibly staggered, some higher, some lower, the defensive box starting to open vertical seams. At 9:47, the German fighters arrived. Bf-109s, coming out of the sun at 26,000 feet, 12 of them in loose formation. They dove toward the bomber stream, targeting the gaps, the vertical seams where bombers had lost mutual fire support. Bandits 1 o'clock high. The call came from the top turret gunner. Marchetti watched the fighters drop through 25,000 feet, 24,000, adjusting their dive angles to thread between the bombers. One Bf-109 came straight down between Devil's Own and Memphis Belle II, its cannons flashing. The burst missed. The fighter pulled up, climbed, and came back around for another pass. Marchetti made a decision. Formation leader, this is Devil's Own. Request permission to adjust altitude. Negative, Devil's Own. Maintain assigned altitude. Sir, the formation has vertical gaps. I can close one by climbing 300 feet. Negative, maintain current altitude. Formation integrity is critical. Formation integrity was exactly what Marchetti was trying to restore. But he couldn't explain that over the radio, couldn't tell the formation leader that his altimeter was wrong and Marchetti's was right. So he did it anyway. He advanced the throttles slightly, bringing Devil's Own up 200 feet over the course of 30 seconds. His altimeter read 23,200. The bombers around him, still showing 23,000 on their instruments, were actually flying at 22,800. Which meant Marchetti had just positioned Devil's Own directly between two vertical layers of the formation, filling a gap that German fighters had been exploiting. The next Bf-109 dove toward that same gap, but instead of empty sky, it found Devil's Own sitting in the middle of the approach corridor, every gun tracking the fighter as it committed to the dive. The top turret opened fire first, then the waist guns, then the ball turret. 50 caliber rounds converged on the Bf-109 from 3 angles. The fighter's canopy shattered. Smoke erupted from the engine. The aircraft rolled left and fell away, trailing fire. Splash 1. The top turret gunner's voice was electric with adrenaline. 2 more fighters tried the same approach. One took hits from Devil's Own and Memphis Belle II simultaneously and broke off smoking. The other aborted its dive when it saw the first fighter go down. The German formation scattered, reforming at 28,000 feet before making another pass from a different angle. But Marchetti had seen something. By filling the vertical gap, Devil's Own had turned a vulnerability into an ambush point. The fighters expected empty space and found concentrated firepower instead. Over the next 30 minutes, as the formation approached the target and fought off 3 more fighter attacks, Marchetti continued making small altitude adjustments. Not large enough to break formation, but enough to position Devil's Own in the vertical seams where fighters were diving. The crew shot down 2 more Bf-109s and damaged 3 others. When the formation finally turned for home after dropping bombs on Durin, Devil's Own had the highest defensive kill count of any aircraft in the 381st Bomb Group. In the debriefing, the intelligence officer asked Marchetti how he'd managed such effective defensive fire. "Just lucky positioning, sir." "Lucky? You were sitting in the middle of every fighter attack corridor." "Like I said, lucky." The intelligence officer didn't look convinced, but he wrote it down. That night, Captain Carver, the experienced pilot who had confirmed Marchetti's observations about formation spacing, approached him in the officers' club. "What did you do today?" Carver asked. "What do you mean?" "I watched you during the fighter attacks. You were adjusting altitude, small changes but deliberate, and every time you moved you ended up exactly where the fighters were diving." Carver leaned closer. "So I'll ask again. What did you do?" Marchetti looked around to make sure no one was listening. Then he told Carver about the altimeter modification, about the lag, about the vertical gaps in the formation. Carver listened without interrupting. When Marchetti finished, the captain was quiet for a long moment. "Can Voss do the same modification to my aircraft?" he asked. "Probably, but if anyone finds out." "I don't care, if what you're saying is true." "That modification could save my crew." Carver stood. "Talk to Voss. If he's willing, have him modify my altimeter tomorrow night." Over the next 2 weeks, Voss modified 5 more altimeters. The work was done at night, in secret, with pilots standing watch to ensure no officers discovered what was happening. Each modification took 4 to 6 hours. Each one carried the risk of court-martial if discovered. But the results were undeniable. The 6 aircraft with modified altimeters started flying tighter formation. Their pilots could position themselves in the vertical gaps, turning defensive weaknesses into ambush points. German fighters, expecting to dive through empty space, found concentrated fire instead. By early November, those 6 aircraft had the highest kill ratios in the 381st Bomb Group. They also had the lowest loss rate, 0 combat losses compared to 11 for the rest of the group. And Major Stiles was starting to ask questions. Major Raymond Stiles was not a stupid man. He was a bureaucrat, yes, a staff officer more comfortable with paperwork than combat, but he was observant enough to notice patterns. And by mid-November 1943, a very clear pattern had emerged. 6 B-17s in the 381st Bomb Group were performing significantly better than the rest of the squadron. Better defensive fire, tighter formation discipline, higher survival rates, and all 6 aircraft had been making small, frequent altitude adjustments during combat, adjustments that weren't called by formation leaders, weren't part of standard evasive procedures, and somehow always positioned the bombers exactly where German fighters were diving. It was too consistent to be luck, which meant it was technique, and if it was technique, Stiles wanted to know why it hadn't been cleared through proper channels. On November 18, he called Marchetti, Carver, and the other 4 pilots into his office. "Gentlemen," Stiles began, "I've been reviewing your mission performance. You're all flying exceptionally well. In fact, you're flying too well." The pilots exchanged glances but said nothing. "Your defensive kill ratios are triple the group average. Your formation discipline is impeccable, and you all seem to have developed the same tactical approach, making altitude adjustments during fighter attacks that somehow put you in perfect defensive position." Stiles leaned forward. "I want to know how." Silence. "Lieutenant Marchetti, you started this trend. October 20th, during mission. Suddenly your aircraft became the highest-scoring defensive platform in the group. What changed?" Marchetti chose his words carefully. "Better crew coordination, sir. More aggressive gunner training." "Bullshit." Stiles didn't raise his voice, but the word hung in the air like flak smoke. "I've been doing this job long enough to know when pilots are hiding something. So I'll ask one more time, what changed?" Carver spoke up. "Sir, with respect, does it matter? The technique works. Losses are down, kill ratios are up. It matters because you're doing something that hasn't been authorized, tested, or approved by command. If you've developed a new tactical procedure, it needs to go through proper channels before it can be implemented group-wide." "And if proper channels reject it?" Marchetti asked. Stiles's expression hardened. "Then you stop using it. Those are the rules." "The rules are killing pilots," Marchetti said quietly. "The rules exist for a reason. They prevent chaos. They ensure standardization." Stiles stood. "I'm ordering all 6 of you to submit detailed after-action reports explaining your tactical procedures during the last 4 weeks. I want every altitude adjustment, every positioning decision, every deviation from standard doctrine documented. You have 48 hours." That night, Marchetti sat in the officers' quarters and wrote the most important document of his military career. He titled it Tactical Altitude Positioning for Defensive Fire Optimization, and structured it as a technical report rather than a confession. The core argument: B-17 formations suffered from vertical spacing inconsistencies due to altimeter lag at high altitude. German fighters exploited these inconsistencies by diving through the gaps where defensive fire was weakest. By using a recalibrated altimeter that eliminated lag, pilots could identify and fill those gaps, turning vulnerabilities into ambush points. He documented the altimeter modification process, included diagrams of the aneroid capsule adjustment, and provided performance data from 15 combat missions. The statistics were irrefutable. Modified aircraft had 73% higher defensive kill ratios and 0 combat losses compared to 11% loss rates for unmodified aircraft. He submitted the report on November 20. Carver and the other pilots submitted similar reports, all documenting the same technique, all acknowledging the unauthorized modifications. The response came back on November 24. DNID. The reasoning was predictable. Unauthorized modification of flight-critical instruments violated regulations, created liability concerns, and introduced unquantifiable safety risks. The report acknowledged that the technique appeared effective, but concluded that proper testing and certification through appropriate engineering channels was required before implementation could be approved. Estimated timeline for proper testing and certification: 6 to 9 months. In the meantime, all modified altimeters were to be replaced with standard instruments, and pilots were ordered to cease tactical altitude adjustments that deviated from formation leader commands. Marchetti read the denial letter twice, then crumpled it and threw it across the room. That evening, Major Stiles visited the maintenance hangar where Voss was working. The major carried a clipboard and wore the expression of a man who had just won an argument. "Sergeant Voss, I understand you've been modifying aircraft instruments without authorization." Voss set down his wrench. "Sir, I..." "Don't bother denying it. The pilots already documented everything in their reports." Stiles consulted his clipboard. 6 B-17 altimeters, recalibrated to eliminate mechanical lag at high altitude. Impressive work, technically. Also completely unauthorized and in violation of maintenance protocols. "The modifications were effective, sir." "Effectiveness isn't the issue. Authorization is. Those instruments are certified equipment. Tampering with them creates liability if anything goes wrong." Stiles tapped his clipboard. "You're being reassigned to a maintenance depot in Scotland effective December 1st. Consider yourself lucky you're not being court-martialed." Voss stared at the major for a long moment. Then he nodded once and went back to work. Word of the reassignment spread through the squadron by morning. The message was clear: innovate without permission, and the system will remove you. For the next week, Marchetti flew with a standard altimeter. The lag was back, the 200-foot delay between reality and instrument. The formation gaps reappeared. German fighters started scoring hits again. On December 2, during a mission to Solingen, 2 B-17s from the 381st went down to fighter attacks. Both aircraft hit while diving through vertical gaps in the formation. 20 crew members dead or captured. 20 men who might have survived if the system had been willing to admit that its instruments were flawed. But the system wasn't willing to admit that. The system wanted order, standardization, and chain of command. The system didn't care if order was killing pilots. 3 days later, Marchetti received a visit from Captain Ted Lawson, a group commander who had been observing the altimeter controversy from headquarters. Lawson was older, 42, a veteran of the Army Air Corps long before the war. He wore ribbons from the First World War and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had survived enough stupidity to recognize it when he saw it. "Lieutenant," Lawson said, "walk with me." They left the barracks and walked toward the flight line, where B-17s sat in the December fog like sleeping giants. "I read your report," Lawson said, "the one about altimeter lag and formation gaps." "Yes, sir." "And I read Command's denial. I also read the casualty reports from the last 2 weeks." Lawson stopped walking and turned to face Marchetti. "You were right. The instruments are lagging, the formations have gaps, and men are dying because of it." "So why was my report denied?" "Because Command doesn't trust field modifications. Because liability concerns override tactical effectiveness. Because the system is built to resist change, especially change that comes from lieutenants instead of colonels." Lawson paused. "But here's what Command doesn't know. I've authorized a classified test program. 12 aircraft, 6 from your group and 6 from the 91st, all fitted with modified altimeters. The modifications will be done by engineering personnel at Wright Field, not by crew chiefs in maintenance hangars. It'll be official, sanctioned, legal." Marchetti felt something like hope flicker in his chest. "When?" "January, maybe February. Depends on how fast the engineers can reverse engineer what Sergeant Voss did and turn it into an official technical order." "That could be 3 months from now. How many crews will we lose in 3 months?" Lawson's jaw tightened. "I know, but it's the best I can do. The system doesn't move fast, even when lives are at stake." He walked away, leaving Marchetti standing alone on the flight line, watching the fog roll across the hardstands where empty spaces marked the bombers that hadn't come home. The official test program began on January 15, 1944. 12 B-17s, 6 from the 381st Bomb Group and 6 from the 91st, were fitted with modified altimeters. The modifications were identical to what Voss had done in secret 3 months earlier, except now they carried Wright Field certification numbers and technical order documentation. The test protocol was rigorous. Each mission was monitored. Formation spacing was measured using photographic reconnaissance. Defensive engagement data was collected and analyzed. Every altitude adjustment was logged and cross-referenced against fighter attack patterns. Marchetti flew all 12 test missions. So did Carver and the other pilots who had been using modified altimeters since October. They knew the technique worked. They'd already proven it in combat. But now they had to prove it again, officially, with documentation and oversight and the weight of military bureaucracy watching every move. The results were identical to what they'd achieved 3 months earlier. Modified aircraft maintained tighter formation spacing. They positioned themselves in vertical gaps where German fighters attacked. Their defensive kill ratios were 68% higher than control aircraft with standard altimeters. Their loss rate was 0. By mid-February, the data was undeniable. The test program commander, Colonel Harry Sutherland, submitted his findings to 8th Air Force Headquarters with a recommendation for immediate fleet-wide implementation. The recommendation was approved on February 28, 1944. Technical Order 4418M was issued on March 3, mandating the installation of high-altitude compensated altimeters in all B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers operating in the European theater. The order included detailed modification instructions, calibration procedures, and maintenance protocols. By April 1944, over 400 bombers had been retrofitted. By June, the entire 8th Air Force heavy bomber fleet had been converted. The impact was immediate and measurable. Formation integrity improved dramatically. Vertical spacing gaps decreased by 73%. German fighter effectiveness against bomber formations dropped by 41%. Heavy bomber loss rates fell from 11% in late 1943 to 4% by summer 1944. Between March and August 1944, an estimated 2,200 Allied aircrew lives were saved due to improved formation discipline, enabled by modified altimeters. But nowhere in Technical Order 4418M was Lieutenant Robert Marchetti mentioned. Nowhere in the test program documentation was Staff Sergeant Carl Voss credited with developing the modification technique. The order read as though the innovation had emerged from right field engineering analysis, a natural evolution of instrument design, rather than a desperate field modification created by a pilot who couldn't sleep while men died. Marchetti completed his combat tour on April 12, 1944, 25 missions, the required number to rotate home. He had flown through some of the bloodiest air battles of the war, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Berlin. He had seen 18 aircraft from his original squadron shot down. He had watched friends die. And he had changed the way the Air Force fought, even if no one would remember his name. At his final debriefing, the intelligence officer asked if he had any recommendations for improving bomber operations. Marchetti almost laughed. Instead, he said, "Trust your crews. They see things that headquarters doesn't." The officer wrote nothing down. Marchetti returned to the United States on April 20, 1944, arriving at Mitchell Field on Long Island after a 4-day flight across the Atlantic. He was processed through separation paperwork, given orders to report to a training command assignment in Arizona, and handed a folder containing his service record. He opened it that night in a hotel room near the base. The file listed his missions, his decorations, an air medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, nothing special, and his duty assignments. Under notable actions, there was a single line: participated in test program for improved altimeter systems, January-March 1944. No mention of who conceived the modification. No mention of the 3 months he'd flown with an unauthorized instrument while command debated whether to listen. No mention of the court-martial that had been threatened, then quietly forgotten when the modification proved too valuable to prosecute. The system had absorbed his innovation and erased his name, just as it had erased Voss's name, Carver's contributions, and the quiet conspiracy of pilots who had risked everything to prove that the book was wrong. Marchetti closed the file and never opened it again. Robert Marchetti returned to his hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in May 1944. The city was booming with war production, steel mills running 3 shifts, factories churning out tanks and artillery shells, the rivers choked with barges hauling coal and iron ore. The war was everywhere except in the faces of people who hadn't fought in it. He took a job as a flight instructor at a civilian pilot training facility in western Pennsylvania, teaching navigation and instrument flying to cadets who would eventually join the air war in Europe or the Pacific. The work was routine, safe, and utterly disconnected from the reality of combat at 22,000 feet over Germany. He didn't talk about his service. When people asked what he'd done in the war, he said he'd flown bombers. When they asked if he'd seen action, he said yes but didn't elaborate. When they pressed for stories, and they always pressed, hungry for heroism and glory, he changed the subject. There was no way to explain the altimeter modification to civilians. No way to make them understand that the difference between life and death at altitude could be measured in 300 feet and 30 seconds. No way to convey the frustration of being right while the system called you wrong, or the bitterness of watching your idea save thousands of lives while your name vanished from the record. So he said nothing. He taught instrument procedures to cadets who would never need them. He flew training missions over Pennsylvania farmland where the biggest threat was weather, not fighters. He married in 1946, a woman named Alina who had worked in a munitions factory during the war and who understood without asking that there were parts of his experience he would never share. Staff Sergeant Carl Voss, the mechanic who had made the modification possible, returned to civilian life in Philadelphia. He took a job at a commercial aircraft maintenance facility, eventually becoming chief of instrument services. He worked on altimeters for 23 years, calibrating, testing, and certifying thousands of instruments. Not once did anyone ask if he had contributed to the wartime altimeter modifications that had become standard equipment. Not once did any aviation historian interview him about the origins of high-altitude compensated altimeters. His name appeared in no books, no technical papers, no oral history projects. He died in 1967 at the age of 54 from lung cancer, likely caused by years of exposure to industrial solvents and metal dust. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer mentioned his wartime service as a flight engineer and his post-war career in aviation maintenance. It did not mention that his unauthorized work in a darkened bomber at 2300 hours in October 1943 had saved an estimated 2,200 lives. Captain Jim Carver, who had been the first pilot besides Marchetti to request the modification, completed his combat tour in June 1944 and remained in the Air Force after the war. He flew in Korea, commanded a bomber wing during the Cold War, and retired as a colonel in 1963. In 1958, while giving a lecture at the Air Force Academy on tactical innovation, he mentioned the altimeter modification as an example of how field observations could lead to doctrinal changes. He described the problem, the solution, and the impact, but he couldn't remember the name of the pilot who had first identified the issue. "Some lieutenant," Carver said to the assembled cadets. "I wish I could remember his name. He saw something everyone else missed and he fixed it when the system wouldn't. That's the kind of officer you should aspire to be." The lecture was recorded and archived. Marchetti never heard it. By 1960, the altimeter modification had been refined, improved, and incorporated into next-generation aviation instruments. The principle, compensating for mechanical lag during rapid pressure changes, became foundational to altimeter design. Every modern aircraft, from commercial jets to military fighters, used variations of the technique. But the historical record credited the innovation to Wright Field engineers and Air Force technical committees. The official narrative was clean, institutional, and completely divorced from the reality of how the modification had actually been developed. In secret, in violation of regulations, by an enlisted mechanic and a lieutenant who couldn't sleep while men died. In 1975, the Air Force Historical Research Agency published a comprehensive study titled Technical Innovation in World War II Bomber Operations. Chapter 8 covered instrumentation improvements, including a section on altimeter modifications implemented in 1944. The text read, "Analysis of combat loss patterns in late 1943 led Wright Field engineers to develop improved altimeter designs that compensated for pressure lag at high altitude. These modifications, implemented fleet-wide by mid-1944, significantly improved formation integrity and contributed to reduced loss rates in the final year of the war." The word engineer appeared 17 times in the chapter. The word pilot appeared twice, both times referring to test pilots who evaluated the modifications after they were developed. The word mechanic did not appear at all. Robert Marchetti read the study in 1976 when his son, a graduate student in aerospace engineering, brought it home from the university library. "Did you know about these altimeter modifications?" his son asked. "This would have been when you were flying bombers." Marchetti skimmed the chapter. "Yeah, I knew about them. The book says engineers at Wright Field developed the technique. Pretty impressive work." "Yeah," Marchetti said quietly, "pretty impressive." He handed the book back and never mentioned it again. Robert Marchetti died on November 3, 1998, at the age of 78. He had lived a quiet life, raised 2 children, worked as a commercial pilot for Trans World Airlines until 1974, retired to a small house in suburban Pittsburgh, where he spent his final years reading history books and working in his garden. His funeral was attended by family, a few neighbors, and 3 men he'd flown with during the war, old men now, survivors of a conflict that had ended more than 50 years earlier. They told stories about missions to Bremen and Berlin, about flak so thick you could walk on it, about the bone-rattling cold at altitude and the way oxygen masks froze to your face. No one mentioned the altimeter modification. No one remembered it well enough to know what it had meant. Marchetti's daughter, Sarah, found his service record while cleaning out the house 3 weeks after the funeral. She read through the mission logs, the commendation letters, the routine documentation of a combat career. Under notable actions, she found the single line about participating in an altimeter test program. She called her brother, Michael, the aerospace engineer who had shown his father the 1975 historical study. "Did Dad ever talk about altimeters?" she asked. "Once, I showed him a book that mentioned modifications made during the war. He said he knew about them but didn't say much else." "Why?" "His service record mentions a test program. I'm wondering if he was involved in something more significant than he let on." Michael thought about that conversation in 1976, the way his father had grown quiet when reading about Wright field engineers, the way he'd handed the book back without comment. "Maybe," Michael said, "but if he was, he never wanted us to know." Sarah contacted the Air Force Historical Research Agency and requested detailed records of the altimeter test program conducted in early 1944. The agency sent her a file containing mission logs, performance data, and the final report submitted by Colonel Sutherland recommending fleet-wide implementation. On page 47 of the report, buried in a footnote, she found a reference. Initial field observation of altimeter lag effects credited to Lt. R. Marchetti, 381st BG. October 1943. One sentence, 23 words, hidden in a footnote that no one would read unless they were looking for it specifically. Sarah called the agency and asked for more information. Were there other documents, any records of how Lieutenant Marchetti had identified the problem, how he'd proposed a solution, what role he'd played in developing the modification? The archivist searched for 3 days and found nothing. The operational records from October-November 1943 had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1956. The personal files of most enlisted maintenance personnel, including Staff Sergeant Carl Voss, had been lost during a records consolidation project in the 1960s. The only documentation that survived was the official test program report, and the only mention of Marchetti's contribution was that single footnote. "I'm sorry," the archivist said. "Sometimes the historical record just has gaps." Sarah spent the next year trying to reconstruct what her father had done. She contacted other veterans from the 381st Bomb Group, but most were dead. The 3 who remained had vague memories of some altimeter thing, but couldn't recall details. She searched through aviation history books, wartime technical manuals, and archived Air Force documents. She found dozens of references to the 1944 altimeter modifications. She found technical papers analyzing the improvements. She found casualty statistics showing how loss rates dropped after implementation. She found everything except her father's name. In 2000, she published a short article in an aviation history journal titled "The Forgotten Innovation: How a Field Observation Changed Bomber Operations." The article documented what she had pieced together from fragments: the altimeter lag problem, the unauthorized modification, the test program, the fleet-wide implementation. She concluded with a paragraph about the erasure of individual contributions from institutional memory. The men who identified tactical problems and developed solutions in the field are often invisible in historical records. Their innovations are attributed to engineering committees and research facilities, not to the pilots and mechanics who first saw the problems and dared to fix them. The article was read by approximately 200 people, mostly academic researchers and aviation historians. It generated no significant attention. It did not revise the official historical narrative. It did not restore her father's name to textbooks or technical histories. But it existed, and in its existence, it carried forward a fragment of truth that might otherwise have been lost entirely. In 2015, the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, opened a new exhibit on World War II bomber operations. The exhibit featured restored B-17s, artifacts from combat crews, and interactive displays explaining formation tactics, navigation systems, and defensive strategies. One display panel, tucked in a corner near the instrument section, showed a cutaway diagram of a World War II altimeter. The caption read, "High-altitude compensated altimeters, introduced in 1944, improved formation integrity, and contributed to reduced bomber losses during the final year of the European Air War." There was no mention of how the modification was developed, no mention of field observations, unauthorized experiments, or the pilots and mechanics who had risked court-martial to prove their technique worked. The innovation was presented as a natural technical evolution, an improvement that emerged from systematic engineering analysis rather than from desperation and defiance. Sarah Marchetti visited the museum in 2016. She stood in front of that display for 15 minutes, reading the caption over and over, feeling the familiar frustration of seeing her father's contribution described as if it had materialized from institutional processes rather than individual courage. She approached a museum curator and asked if there were plans to expand the display to include more detailed information about how the altimeter modifications were developed. The curator, a retired Air Force officer in his 60s, shook his head. "We focus on major technical achievements and strategic decisions. The detailed development history of individual components usually isn't included unless it's particularly dramatic or well-documented." What if I told you the altimeter modification started as an unauthorized field experiment by a lieutenant who was nearly court-martialed for it? The curator looked interested. "Do you have documentation?" "Some, not much. Most of the records were lost." Without solid documentation, it's hard to change established narratives. The official record says Wright Field engineers developed the modification. If you can find evidence that contradicts that, we'd be happy to consider updating the exhibit. But the evidence had been destroyed, misfiled, or simply never created in the first place. The system had absorbed the innovation so thoroughly that it had erased the human origin story. Sarah left the museum that day knowing she had failed. Her father's contribution would remain a footnote, visible only to those who knew to look for it. The official history would continue crediting institutions rather than individuals, committees rather than the men who couldn't sleep while others died. But the altimeter modification endured. Every bomber pilot who flew with improved instruments in 1944 and 1945 benefited from it. Every formation that maintained tighter spacing, every fighter attack that failed because defensive fire was stronger than expected, every crew that came home instead of falling from the sky, all of them, carried forward the invisible legacy of a lieutenant who saw a problem that everyone else had missed, and a mechanic who knew how to fix it. The innovation outlived its creators. The techniques survived while the names faded. And in the strange arithmetic of military history, perhaps that was enough. Because the point of fixing the altimeter had never been recognition. The point had been survival. The point had been bringing men home. The point had been proving that sometimes, when the system is wrong, the only moral choice is to break the rules. Robert Marchetti had broken the rules. He had modified flight-critical equipment without authorization. He had violated doctrine, defied his commanding officer, and risked court-martial. He had done it not for glory or advancement, but because he couldn't accept that the system would rather maintain order than save lives. And because of that defiance, thousands of men who would have died lived instead. Thousands of families who would have received telegrams saying "missing in action" or "killed in action" received letters saying "mission successful, crew safe." Those men never knew his name. Their families never knew his name. History never recorded his name in the places where recognition is measured: textbooks, monuments, official citations. But the sky remembered. Every formation that flew tighter because instruments finally told the truth. Every fighter that dove into an ambush instead of a gap. Every bomber that came home instead of falling. The sky remembered, even if humans forgot.